Right, Boker Tov, everybody. We are live and alive now here at Chabad Longevity Club and continuing our discussion from yesterday about the anniversary of passing of Rabbi Levi Yitschak Schneerson, the father of the Rebbe. Yesterday, we looked at some of his teachings and some biographical sketches, ideas of his life on video and discussion, and we're going to continue that today. I got another one or two videos for you, and actually, there's a lot more videos, and what you can do is after lunch, we're going to put them up on the screen outside with the volume up. And the videos we're playing this week have to do with the life and legacy of Rabbi Levi Yitschak. So you can learn more about him on the videos. And what we'll do here in our class is discuss some of his teachings and lessons that we could learn. So today's teaching that I want to focus on with you, I'm just waiting for my computer to start up. It seems to be really going a little slow. Yesterday's teaching had to do with how the entirety of the Torah encompasses. The Torah starts off with the letter Beis and ends with the letter Lamed, which literally means Baal, which means don't, right? Don't add, don't subtract from the Torah. That was the message that we discussed yesterday. And those same letters from the beginning, from the end of the Torah to the beginning, comprise the letters Lamed and Beis, which is Lev, which means the heart. That's the heart of the Torah. No need to add or subtract. God gave us as many commandments, as many mitzvahs as we really need to know. We are live and alive now here at that's just what I needed for my and continuing our discussion from yesterday about the anniversary of passing of Rabbi Levi Yitschak Schneerson, the father of the Rebbe. Pardon? Yes, I told you to meet his teaching and some. I thought we were needed, but it seems like the computer likes my voice. Okay, so what we're going to do now is look at another teaching of Rabbi Levi Yitschak that I think you'll also find interesting, that we can learn a lesson from it. Now, this lesson, I think, is a little bit more complex because it flows literally between different aspects of Torah. So between the literal, between the symbolic, between the interpretive, between the mystical. As I explained yesterday, that the word pardes, orchard, is comprised of these four letters in Hebrew, pshat, remez, drush, sod. So you have the simple understanding, the homiletic meaning, the expounding, like what sermons are based on, and the mystical, sublime, deeper ideas. And we're going to try to explore a teaching of his that also explores all these areas and aspects, and see, just to give you a taste of this teaching. So what you're looking on the screen is the Holy Temple. And you can see the arrow pointing. There was a chamber in the Beis HaMikdash, which the high priest would quarantine in this chamber every year for 7 days. What 7 days? Who remembers? Who knows? The 7 days before Yom Kippur. Very good. And during this time, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, would prepare himself mentally and spiritually for everything he would have to endure and go through and experience and representing the Jewish people on the holiest day of the year, on Yom Kippur. What was the name of this room? If you read Hebrew, you can see it on the screen. Lishkas. Actually, that's the next name. So I should have put the first slide on, but I didn't. The original name was Lishkas Ha'etz. Originally, it was called the wooden chamber. Okay, why? Very simply, it had wooden paneling. The Gemara tells us that the wood was plastered over because wood was not permitted to show in the Beis HaMikdash. So they plastered over it. And the tractate Yuma, it says that the chamber was previously called, actually before that, Lishkas Balvati. Balvati is a Greek term, means the chamber of important officials. So it was called Lishkas Ha'etz at a later time, and I don't know when they started using Greek, but I guess when there was Greek influence in Israel, the Greek terminologies also took, you could say today, many, even in Israel, how English has a tremendous influence, and there are many things using English names or maybe Latin names. And either way, I don't know if it was concurrent or at different stages, but at some stage it was called Lishkas Bavlati, which means the chamber for important officials. And later on it became known as Lishkat Ha'etz, the wood chamber. And we're also going to look at how Kabbalistically the names and the importance and the significance. But there was another name which you could see on the screen that this room became known as, and that was Lishkas Parhedrin, which is also a Greek term, which means the chamber of, Lishkas is chamber, Parhedrin means the assessors, okay? Now the Mishnah, if you look at this Mishnah in Tractate Yuma, it says, in fact, I think it's the very beginning of Tractate Yuma, the tractate of the Talmud that deals with the laws of Yom Kippur. And the word appears as Palhedrin there, but in the Gemara it's called Parhedrin. So you could use either name, but Rabbi Levi in his teachings calls it Parhedrin, which is the Talmudic term. Either way, it refers to this low. What is a Parhedrin? Again, it means assessors. What assessor? So it was a reference to the tax collectors, the SARS in Israel 2,000 years ago. Okay? You deal with SARS? I was talking to a gentleman the other day, a man who tells me he doesn't have much money left to his name. He recently, unfortunately, went through a very difficult experience where he doesn't even know how. SARS came to him. He's retired for years. And SARS claimed they did an audit and he owes them 11 million rand. And he's in a tumultuous state because you can imagine he's retired for many years already. And now they're coming after him for 11 bar from some long time back story. He doesn't know how they came up with this calculation. And you can imagine what it's doing to an 80-something-year-old man who's not exactly in the mood of this situation. So, but tax assessors is not a new phenomenon. And in Israel, there are still tax assessors. There's an old story of a pita shop in Tel Aviv that every day this guy would come and say, do you mind if I get the leftovers? You know, you cut off the top of the pita to put inside the falafel and the shawarma. Can I just get those little leftover pieces from the tops of the pitas? So the guy from the shop says, I don't mind. Why not? We'll give you those pieces. One day, the Israeli revenue collectors come in and they're fining him a tremendous amount. He says, what for? They said, we've been collecting the tops of your pitas and we realize you're under, not claiming, what's the word? Not claiming, under declaring how many pitas you're selling. Although, as much as that story makes sense, it also doesn't make sense. Who says that every pita he cuts is a sale? Maybe he cuts one pita and gives away one pita. I don't know. He's in big trouble, yeah. So why did they change the name from Lishkas Ha'etz or Lishkas Hababli, right? Which previously, those were the names. This room, Lishkas Balvati, the chamber of the officials, and Lishkas Ha'etz, the wooden chamber. And now they changed its name again to Lishkas Palhedrin, the assessor's chamber. What's this about? Should we read it in the Talmud itself? Let me see if we have that screen here. Here we go. Here it is in the Talmud itself. Says the Gemara, there was unfortunately a time in Israel when the high priesthood, which you would think is a position that's given to the righteous, to the noble, to the pious, to the qualified priests. No, who was getting this? People were paying every year for this position. And how did they pay for it? So the Gemara says the high priests paid to be appointed were replaced annually like Parhedrin, like these tax assessors who were replaced every 12 months. Why is a tax assessor replaced every 12 months? What do you think? Yes, so they won't get corrupted. Exactly. This was to prevent people from cozying up to the tax collectors and extracting concessions from them. I don't know if SARS does that, but in Israel, that's what they used to do. Change every year, you would have a new tax collector so that whatever deal you may have been able to arrange with one tax collector doesn't carry on to the next one. And that's the way they did it. In banks. Really? Why don't they want you to be familiar with the bank manager? Don't you want? Oh, really? Are they not allowed to do favors? What kind of favors can they do in the bank? Yeah? Okay, that's nice. So the Gemara says they called it the chamber of Parhedrin, of the tax assessor, because the Kohanim would change so frequently. Because the position was corrupted. Now I want to read to you what Rashi explains. Rashi tells us, let's go back to the Hanukkah story. Remember the Hanukkah story? Who were the brave people that fought the Assyrian Greeks who were trying to overcome, who were trying to corrupt Judaism at the time, and were assimilating, and they were what's the terminology for it? They were modernizing. There's a better word for this. Assimilating, modernizing, liberalizing Judaism at the time of the Hanukkah story. The Maccabees. Who was the leader of the Maccabees? What was his name? Yehuda, Judah Maccabee, right? He was the hero of the Hanukkah story. And what happened since then? It's a very interesting story. While it starts off very heroic and good, they established the Hashmonaei royal dynasty, the Hasmoneans. In fact, in England today, there's a school system called Hasmonean, right? Where did the name Hasmonean come from? It came from the Hashmonaei. Now, at the time, Yehuda and his brothers who started this gang to fight against the Assyrian Greeks, the Yevanim, they were righteous, they were pious, they were good. But as we discussed in other shiurim that we've previously learned, their descendants, unfortunately, were corrupted. And what did they do? The position of high priest, which is meant to be a noble, righteous, pious position, they took to auctioning off that position to the highest bidder. How do you like that? You could bid to be the Kohen. And now I have to tell you joke number 873, since that's the joke that's appropriate here, about the fellow who really badly wants to be a Kohen. And he begs and pleads, and the rabbi says, can't do. To make the joke sound really good, we have to say he gave a nice donation, and the rabbi finally said, okay, we'll make you a Kohen. But tell me after he pays, why do you so badly want to be a Kohen? My father was a Kohen, and my grandfather was a Kohen. I also want to be a Kohen. Okay, stale joke. But the point here is, this was a position that, yes, it was only people of the Kohen dynasty who were allowed to be Kohanim. You couldn't, my mother's family were Kohanim, and there are clues to know which families are Kohanim. Like the name Cohen or Katz are oftentimes people who come from a Kohen family. Like the name Levi and Siegel and other similar names are Levites, Levim. However, there's also exceptions to that. Because first of all, a family could lose their Kohen status. How does a Kohen lose their Kohen status? There are many such instances that have happened, whether it means a Kohen marrying somebody they're not allowed to. For example, a Kohen's not allowed to marry a divorcee. If a Kohen does marry a divorcee or marries out of the faith, while the father is a Kohen, he and his children lose the ability, the privilege to perform the duties in the temple, and they can no longer do so. And there are other such instances too. So then they lose that status of Kohen. Even though the name is Kohen, and even though the grandfather and great-grandfather was a Kohen, they no longer can be Kohens. So back to that joke, even though his father and grandfather was a Kohen, doesn't make him the Kohen if he lost that position. So just so you understand. Yeah, you had a question? Oh, okay. So now we have to understand what was going on in the temple at that time. Rashi explains we had these corrupt Kohanim who weren't qualified for the position. They were vying, they were bidding for the position. They were paying for it, okay? And they didn't get the position because of their piety, because of their sagacity, because of their nobility, but because of their wealth. They paid for that position. So it sounds like South Africa. Corruption pays or paid. And what happened? You had unworthy, unqualified people in this position who were assuming the office. But here's a very interesting thing. Unlike in South African governments, where you could stay in that position even with corruption, and it takes years of legal battles and all that in order to fight it. What's happening with Malema these days? And others, what's happening with him? A yarmulke and a talus, okay? You never know what's going on. Maybe he's connecting with his Jewish ancestry. Maybe he'll stop being so anti-Israel if he reads what we say in our Jewish liturgies, and then he realizes he's being, a hypocrite if he criticizes the Jewish people that way. Either way, that's Malema. What about the other guy, McKinsey? What's the tall, big guy? Gator McKinsey. He's being probed for corruption now too. He spoke at our Miracle Drive 2 years ago. You got to be careful with who we're getting up these days. But, is anybody in positions that aren't corrupt? Everybody. There's maybe just different levels. What do they say? Power corrupts and absolute power Corrupts absolutely. And it wasn't any different. Rashi's explaining that in the temple back in those days, there were corrupted Kohanim. But the difference I wanted to explain was that even if a Kohen was corrupted, you know that if a Kohen Gadol, high priest, who went into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, if he wasn't pure, you know what happened to them? Died. He didn't come out alive. And in fact, we were watching a video. There's a movie, a very good movie that was produced in Israel recently. I'm forgetting its name, but I have it on my phone somewhere because I was going to show it on Tisha B'Av at our shul, but I couldn't find where to screen it from. But there's a new movie that came out in Israel. Very well, I mean, from the preview that I watched, it looks like a very well-produced film with actors and all. And they show you how the corrupt Kohanim would be pulled out with a rope from the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. They would go in wearing a rope because no ordinary person could enter this special place. And because these people were corrupt, they wouldn't come out alive. They had to be replaced each year. And our sages took to calling this chamber, the chamber in which the Kohanim, the high priests, had to prepare themselves for 7 days before Yom Kippur. They called it the Lishkas Parhedrin, which meant the assessor's chamber, even though that wasn't its name. Right? We know from before, the Gemara called it originally Lishkas Balvati, the chamber for the important dignitaries, right? The important officials. Or it was also known as Lishkas Ha'etz, the wood chamber, because of its wooden panels that would be plastered over because wood itself couldn't be exposed in the temple. And now they gave it a new name, a euphemistic name. The chamber of the tax assessors, because it reminded them of these tax collectors who their position was changed each year, so nobody would cozy up to them and try to extract favors and get concessions and overdrafts, like you said. Well, same thing here. This room became known as the assessor's room, not because this room was used by the tax assessors, but rather because every year there was a new Kohen Gadol. And why was there a new Kohen Gadol each year? Because the high priest would each year be replaced due to them not outliving, they wouldn't live up to the next year. At the same time, I think it's something very interesting. You knew that if you took on this position, you won't survive the year, right? You're not going to be around for next Yom Kippur. So it just goes to show that even though they were somewhat corrupted, what were they aspiring towards? What did they want so badly? To be a Kohen Gadol. And even though they knew they weren't qualified spiritually for the position, they still paid to get that position because they realized that there was something very special and unique about it. And the truth is, the sages talk about that to be the Kohen Gadol meant you were the ultimate spiritual leader of the Jewish people. And yes, we see these were corrupt spiritual leaders, but at the same time, they realized that they're going to die on Yom Kippur. And maybe that too would inspire people to do teshuvah, to repent, because you see the Kohen Gadol didn't survive that holiest day. So there was something too about that. And now, although this term now is not a very refined term, it's like a derogatory term to call this Lishkas Parhedrin, the room of the tax assessors. I think it's something else here about it. Because, firstly, who gave it that name? It was the sages, not the Kohanim themselves. For them, this was a derogatory term. This was making fun of them. Think of it. It's pointing out, it's highlighting their corruption. So why did the sages use this name? I think it was a way to reprimand them in a subtle way, or not so subtle. But it was a warning to them that it could backfire if you were not righteous. You won't outlive the year. You're not going to survive walking into the Holy of Holies. That's a very special, holy, sanctified space, and you're not going to come out alive. And the fact that these people still persevered and still paid for that position, I think is quite unique. Now, after we discuss this, understanding this on the face of it, we have two explanations for the names of this room. On the one hand, Lishkas Ha'etz was called the wooden chamber. Why was it called Lishkas Ha'etz? Because it was made out of wood. Very simple, right? That's the default name. But then the name that the sages gave it, Lishkas Parhedrin, why did they call it the assessor's chamber? Because they were alluding to this unfortunate chapter in the temple's history describing the annual rotation of the high priests, which was again highlighting their corruption, showing that they weren't so noble. Says the Rebbe's father, Levi Yitschak, whose yahrzeit we're observing, that that's not enough. While those are the explanations, Rashi, we just discussed Rashi's explanation. Rashi had a subtitle. He called his commentary Rashi, which was simply his name, Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak. But Rashi had like a subtitle. He's called Ben Chamish Lemikra. What's Ben Chamish Lemikra? For a 5-year-old to understand the Torah. So Rashi tried to explain and simplify any complex areas in Torah. So that's a simple understanding. Rebbe Levi was not satisfied with Rashi. And he probed deeper to uncover the mystical links, because remember, the Torah could be divided into these 4 categories: Pardes, the orchard, which is an acronym of those 4 letters: Pshat, Remez, Drush, Sod, the simple understanding, the allusions, the homiletic interpretations, the Drush, expounding into more lectures, and he did all this, and even going into the depth of the mystical side that this represented. And he wanted to link it all together and to explain to us. So he began with the simple understanding. What was lishkas ha'etz? Literally, it means, we call eitz wood, but what's the real meaning of the word eitz? Barei pri ha'etz. Blessed is Hashem who gives us the fruit of the very good tree. Thank you, Rochelle. So he had a very interesting explanation to understand, what does it mean? Why is it called lishkas ha'etz? The default name, we said, was because that chamber was made up of wood, had wooden panels. But now we're going to go to a much deeper understanding from Rabbi Levi Yitzchak's commentary that he wrote on the margins of the pages, the books he had in jail, and he was in his incarceration in Kazakhstan. And more than that, we know that where did he get the ink from? Well, his wife had self-sacrifice, and she produced this ink for him out of leaves and berries. And let's see what he writes, how the trees, eitz, represent something about longevity and durability, like the name of our program, Chabad Longevity Club, right? So let's read his words. We'll just do the English because we can do both. He says, "Ve'etz moire al arichas yamim." Trees represent long life. As the verse says, the prophet Isaiah tells us, "Kimeya eitzi me'ami," like the days of a tree, so the days of my people. We as a Jewish people, we've endured, we've survived, we've thrived. As we observed Tisha B'Av last week, we realized that although God punished us, but he only exacted that punishment on the bricks and mortar of our temple and not on us who are deserving of it. Says Reb Levi, as long as the high priests were righteous and enjoyed longevity, during that time it was called the wooden chamber, because those Kohanim, they lived long lives. They were righteous, they were pious. There were Kohanim who lived for decades. Remember, if they weren't, and they walked into that Holy of Holies, that was the end. They had to be pulled out with a rope, and that kept happening in the Second Temple era. Afterwards, when the high priests were not righteous, they did not enjoy longevity. And when it was called the Parhedron chamber, which means the assessor's chamber, which was a derogatory term, mocking them by the sages who couldn't pick a fight with them directly because they would make trouble. So instead, they just mocked them and said, next year will be another high priest because these guys are so corrupted and they keep buying the position. Says Rebbe Levi Yitzchak, this name is comprised of 3 words, not just Parhedron, which means a tax assessor. But let's dissect the word Parhedron. What is the word Parhedron? Let's unpack it. It's made up of 3 words. What are the 3 words? Par, har, and din. What does par mean? Par means separateness. What does har mean? That's an easy one. Mountain. And what's din? Judgment. Very good. And all of these 3 terms, they allude to severity and divine judgment, Rebbe Levi Yitzchak says. So he's telling us that this wooden chamber called the Parhedron, which originally was called Lishkas ha'etz, and we said again, the simple understanding is it was paneled with wood. Simple. But says Rebbe Levi Yitzchak, eitz, wood, comes from a tree. That's the Hebrew word eitz means tree. And this alludes to the durability and longevity of the tree. But when the high priests became corrupt and God responded with severity and justice, so now the sages, to mock them, or not to really mock them, there's no point in mocking somebody, but to give to some constructive criticism, to wake them up to their reality, they changed the name to Lishkas Parhedron, the chamber of the tax assessor, to remind them, to show them, to wake them up to their corruption. But let's understand this. This wasn't just a play of words. let's understand this word parhedrin and see how this makes sense. That on the one hand, we have the chamber of the tree, the durability and the longevity of the high priests, and then how he changed the name to describe, or how the sages changed the name to describe the new element of severity, of justice that was involved. So let's look at it like this. Par is from the cognate of the word pirud. What does pirud mean? Separation, okay? Severity divides and disintegrates. Faribbles, separate, divide people. So the first thing is that the par is connected to this concept of gavuras, this idea of discipline, of severity, of separation. Let's go to the next word, har. Right? There's one word, parhedrin, but we're dividing it, we're dissecting it as three words here. The second one, har, is a mountain. What's unique about a mountain? A mountain stays in its place. It's hard, it's unmoving, it's unwavering. That's the second point. And the third point we said was din. What's din? Judgment. God's judgment was harsh, it was unmoving. And it resulted in the early disintegration of the high priest's life. That these high priests who were corrupted died. So it ended their lives. Now let's just think about this. Why would the sages give these high priests such a negative association? Is it appropriate? Were they doing that? Were they trying to mock them, or were they just trying to improve them? What do you think? Is it important that the sages object to the corruption of the high priests? Right? Not objecting would be like tacit support and endorsement. Or was there maybe a positive message in this too? And that's what I'm going to get to now. While we understand the negative message that was, so to say, rebuking them, there was a positive message too. And this is where I believe Yitschak was alluding to here. He says, and this was elucidated by the Rebbe in his teachings, and the Rebbe always looked for the positive and good in every situation. Like I told you when I was in Israel, the people say, Pozetov, here it's good. That's positivity. You see the connection. And the Rebbe expounded on this teaching of his father and revealed a far deeper teaching that I want to share with you. And he found that these two names of the high priest's chamber, the room, the name of Parhedrin and Lishkas Ha'etz, wood, which was the original name, which we saw is not only about the wood paneling, but also about the longevity, the long life, the durability of the righteous, pious, noble priests who experienced a long life. But also, there was the Parhedrin name, which, as we saw here, Parhardin, which represents the separateness, the divisiveness that their corruption caused, and the termination of their lives, and the unwavering mountain that Hashem says, if you're corrupt, you can't stay in this position. But now we're going to look at another role, another understanding of this that I want to put on the text here, and then we'll understand this in a deeper way, how the judgment that is harsh and moving like a mountain and causes the disintegration of life. Let's first read the Rebbe's teaching, and then we'll go back to these slides to understand it better. Says the Rebbe, these two names allude to the dual roles of the high priest. What are they? Eitz. Wood alludes to the labor of the righteous. And the other name the sages gave it, Parhedrin. What is Parhedrin? Says the Rebbe, this is Meramas. This alludes to Avodah Sateshuva, the labor of repentance. What does this mean? So to understand the Rebbe's teaching, he explains this, that the tree is wood, which is sturdy, which we said represents longevity. That alludes to the uninterrupted progress of the righteous, that the righteous constantly keep growing and developing and getting better, which every day we know, as the sign in my office reads, success is a journey, it's not a destination. We don't say, I've arrived, I'm done. Every day we got to keep growing and developing and getting better and better, right? That's the idea of a tzaddik. A tzaddik is an individual whose devotion to God is the straight line of consistent ascent, a journey of constant growth and achievement, of every day bettering myself. In fact, there's a Hasidic tradition, especially the month of Elul coming next week, and Rosh Chodesh and Rosh Hashanah approaching. What is the Hasidic tradition? Every night before we go to sleep, we say to ourselves, Morgen wird sein gorandish. Tomorrow will be a far better day. Some of us do that in the morning. I wake up in the morning, tomorrow will be a better day. But the idea is that I'm not satisfied with the success of yesterday. As a business person is not satisfied with yesterday's success, they want to make more money. Well, spiritually, we also want to grow and become better. So the idea of the wood, a chamber, the lishkas ha'etz, that is alluding to the high priest's responsibility to advance the work of the righteous. What is a high priest? He's a role model to the people. He represents the people, and therefore is meant to inspire the people. Is the high priest inspiring everyone to grow, to become better? That's what the Rebbe does. Exactly. Let's look at the other name, Parhedron. What is Parhedron? Parhedron, we said, is about separation, because these were like the tax assessors who every year would be changed out, and the same thing was these high priests. So it's a more complicated role that the high priest played, but says the Rebbe, this is not a negative, poking a fun at them. No, this is actually a positive, an uplifting message, why it was called Parhedron. What's the significance of Parhedron? Many people struggle. Many people have challenges, right? We all do. It's part of the human condition. King Solomon tells us no righteous person does only good and never sins. Every one of us has our challenges, has our failings. But you know what we learned fail stands for? First attempt in learning. I get knocked down, I get up again. And this is what the high priest also represented, not only for the perfect people. The Kohen Gadol didn't only represent the righteous. He also represented the average person who has shortcomings, who has failings, who gets knocked down and gets up. And the Kohen Gadol had to be relatable to them too. Somebody told me the rabbis of yesteryear were like on the pedestal. You couldn't connect, you couldn't relate to them. Today's rabbis are more relatable. I wasn't around in those days, so I can't answer. But that's what people tell me. But the Kohen Gadol couldn't only be somebody who represented the tzaddik. On the one hand, he did. He had to represent the righteous. He had to show you the ideal human. A human is able and capable of achieving the greatest things. But at the same time, the Kohen Gadol had to be somebody who everybody could relate to. And so even the people who stray from the proper path, but they could find their way back. Like the GPS says, recalculating. No matter how far lost you get, you can always, no matter where you may roam, you can always come back home. Reminds me of a great story of the Alter Rebbe. Somebody once came to the Alter Rebbe. Unfortunately, his son went off the derech. You know what off the derech means? It wasn't any longer on the path of a religious, observant Jewish life. And now this man felt really bad. His son became a horse racer, and now he's completely abandoned the spiritual path. And he came to the Alter Rebbe begging, please, won't you talk to the child? Alter Rebbe said, bring him over, I'll talk to him. So he comes to his son, please, you got to go talk to the Rebbe. He says, I don't want to talk to the Rebbe. I don't need it. He says, I'm a horse racer. If the rabbi could talk to me about horse racing, then I could talk to him. So he comes to the Rebbe, he says, the boy only wants you to talk about horse racing. So the Rebbe says, no problem. If you look at our Rebbe, was the great-grandson of the Alter Rebbe, the son of Rabbi Levi Yitschak. Our Rebbe did the same. The Rebbe would talk to kids about baseball and soccer and their ideas, and would share with them lessons about it. So his great-grandfather, the Alter Rebbe, did the same. He said to the young man, I hear you've become a horse racer. Let's talk about your horse racing. So he starts telling the Alter Rebbe about his horse and about how fast the stallion goes, and this word, and the difference between a mirror and a horse and a this, and horsepower and this. And the Alter Rebbe is showing interest and listening, which is the most important thing. Anyways, eventually the Alter Rebbe says to him, I wonder, what's the big difference? Why, if I have a stallion that goes 100 kilometers an hour, or a little mare that goes, a pony that goes much slower? He says, Rebbe, for horse racing, like I do at the Ananda, what do you call that club? The horse track. It's right behind my house. You know that? What do they call it? Is it next door to your, who's that, your brother? Don't you have family? No, not you. Kind of. What's that? Never been there. You got to go. But what's that game? They call polo, right? The polo club. Ananda Polo Club. Either way, he says that obviously the faster the horse, the quicker it could go. I don't remember the exact exchange, but the Alter Rebbe starts asking him, that's all fine and well if you're on the right track. But what happens if you get lost? If you get lost, the fast horse seems to be not the ideal one because it's getting so far lost, right? You've gone so fast that you're so lost. So maybe then the smaller horse, the slower horse is better, is it? You won't get so far lost. So the Rebbe says no. Still, the fast horse is better because just as you could get lost quickly, you could find your way back quicker too. And so I don't remember the rest of the conversation, but the story goes that the Alter Rebbe inspired him to return back and said, it doesn't matter where you've roamed, you could always come back home, you could always come back to the right path. And this is the idea that we're explaining here, is that the Kohen Gadol was not meant to only be for those who were righteous and pious and noble and on the right track, but also those who fell off the track, that they could also find their way back. And that the Kohen Gadol shouldn't be somebody who's aloof and superior and impossible to relate to, but rather somebody who could inspire that springboard of return, of connection, that people who struggle with their behaviors, they could also be on the right path. And the point is that in order to move forward in a spiritual journey, the individual, the penitent, cannot be self-defined in terms of their previous persona. We all made mistakes in our past. If we defined ourselves by our past, we might get stuck there. Because if I made mistakes, we all made mistakes. So now I get stuck in the quagmire of that mistake. That doesn't help. You have to be able to break with the past and become a completely new person and say, what was, right? But what will be is the question. By disavowing my previous self and adopting a new self, a self-identity that yesterday's actions are completely anathema, are unrecognizable, are the past. Then we're able to break with the previous behavioral patterns. We're able to return to God and say, you know what? I made mistakes. That's part of it. We have to accept it. We have to acknowledge it. Well, in Russia, that's exactly what we say. CPR, charity, prayer, repentance, teshuvah, tefillah, tzedakah. I mean, teshuvah doesn't say to ignore the past. Teshuvah says that the past is a springboard to my greater future, that I'll grow from it. I've learned from my mistakes not to repeat them and to improve and become a better person. So the Rebbe went on to explain the link between the teshuvah and this concept of parhedrin, of the assessor, the tax collector, that this room was being called, that it wasn't just a derogatory term. The sages weren't just trying to poke fun on these corrupt high priests. How? So this takes the Hasidic understanding. The high priest's support for somebody who was struggling, that to inspire them, to influence them, they can make a proper change, is alluded to in this concept of the parhedrin. Because the parhedrin officers, the tax assessors, they did not have a tenure. What was the rule in those days? Like you said, bankers change, tax assessors did too. After a year, that's it. You retire, you move to another job, a different position, because they don't want people to cozy up and to extract favors and to take bribery. Now you had a new person. Right? The next appointee was a completely different person. And perhaps that's the idea, says the Rebbe. This is like a Baal Teshuvah, a penitent. My previous character expires. I was nasty yesterday. I wasn't good. I wasn't the ideal. But today is a new day. And that's why we say it at night before we go to sleep. Because we're not going to put it, we're going to say already, I'm going to sleep now. The day that was is over. But tomorrow is going to be Gor Andish, a completely different new day. And that person moves forward in an entirely different direction. I'm going to be a better person. And now that brings us back to this whole concept of parhedrin. Remember, what's par? Separateness. Har? A mountain. Din? Judgment. Very good. Says the Rebbe, this refers respectively to three ideas. We have the par, the separateness, is about using self-restraint that sets distinctions between right and wrong. That I have to know what's right and wrong. Yes, I messed up yesterday, but the only way I can become a better person is if I will prevent myself from doing this again tomorrow. So what am I going to do different tomorrow? How am I going to distinguish between my past mistakes and know that tomorrow will be different and better? So for that, we also have the har, the mountain. We make resolutions that are unmoving, that are ironclad, like a mountain doesn't move. You can't just pick up the mountain and move it. And therefore, our resolutions shouldn't just be like New Year's resolutions. I'm going to go to the gym, in 1 year, out the other. But how are my resolutions going to be strong, resolute, ironclad? You know what I'm saying? Unmoving like a mountain. And that brings us to din. What's din? Judgment. That we judge our past behaviors honestly and objectively, not to pull me down, to pick me up, so I could do the right teshuvah, so that I could become a better person. Because we can only improve if we acknowledge and recognize and take responsibility for our past mistakes. And that was the teaching here of the Rebbe's father, that the two names of the chamber don't reflect a diminution. It's not just a derogatory term, as Rashi points out, there was an element of, because there was corruption, we understand why they, so to say, it was a constructive criticism. But more than being a constructive criticism, it was a very constructive role, the dual role of the Kohen Gadol. On the one hand, it was called the Lishkas Ha'etz, the wood chamber. Wood, we said, is from a tree, and that represents longevity. And that was to support the long, uninterrupted journey of the righteous. And that was to inspire the people by seeing the Kohen Gadol as a righteous, pious person. And hopefully they would want to emulate and aspire to that direction in life. And at the same time, Parhedrin was to support the transformative journey of the penitent, to say, you know something, no matter what mistakes I've made, I can improve, I can become a better person. And I think this is a whole idea that's worthwhile to understand, that these teachings reflect a Hasidic perspective and a love for our fellow Jews. The first teaching demonstrates the belief that anyone who follows the Torah meticulously to serve God with a complete heart, remember, the person we said, Baal, don't add, don't subtract from the Torah. You don't need to. God gave you 613 commandments, not 612, not 614. Don't add, don't subtract. No need to do any of that. But the same word Baal has the letters in it, Lamed Bet. What does Lamed Bet spell? Lev, the heart. And that shows us the love that we should have for each other. And the second teaching about the names that were used for the chamber of the high priest. First, Lishkas Ha'etz, the wood chamber, wood representing the longevity of the Kohanim, that the Kohen lived a long life because he meant to inspire righteousness. And at the same time, what seemed to be a derogatory term, Lishkas Parhedrin, the room of the tax assessor, while it seems negative, also was about that even a negative, even a sinner can have a beautiful future, can see a great life ahead. And it's important for us to recognize, not to define somebody that just because they failed doesn't make them a failure. And though he was a sophisticated realist who understood the realities of his time and had to deal with many difficult situations, including the communist regime, and many of the communists were Jewish themselves and strayed from Judaism. You look at the guys, Trotsky, that Leo Trotsky was born Levi Bronstein. The chief rabbi of Moscow was Rabbi Yaakov Maza. He was the grandfather of comedian Rabbi Jackie Mason. You might know Jackie Mason for his jokes. He had more Gentiles in his congregation than Jews. So he moved to Broadway, right? Jackie Mason's grandfather used to say that it's the Trotskys who make the trouble, and it's the Bronsteins who suffer the consequence of it, something like that. But the point is, Reb Leivik refused to see the behavior, even the bad behavior of these Yivasectia. Yivasectia means the Jewish section of the Communist Party, as a reflection of their inner values, but he saw their potential, that even though they were bad and they caused trouble and they sent them off to exile. I went to Kazakhstan 7 years ago for his yard site. 7 years ago, you might remember, I went off to Kazakhstan for a few days to be there for his yard site. How did he land up in Kazakhstan? He was exiled and he was locked and incarcerated for what crime? Teaching Torah, spreading Judaism, making sure matzahs were really kosher for Pesach and not just labeled as such. That was his behavior. He tried to see the good and the potential. And unfortunately, we know at that time many young Jews were swept up in this idealism of the communist movement. Some time ago, I saw there was a series on Netflix all about that era. And it gives you, they reenact a lot of it. You see, it was a bloody era. It was a difficult time. the revolutions and people trying to break free from the life that they were experiencing. And many Jews, unfortunately, got caught up as KGB informants against the co-religionists. I've told you previously, maybe worth repeating, one of the stories about my own grandmother. Yesterday, I told you the story about how she cut her hand with a glass. Perhaps another good story was in around 1941 or so, my grandmother had a job in the KGB. She worked for the KGB. She had a secretarial job. She was a pretty young lady. She dressed for it, and they liked her there. But you know who she was really working for? Chabad Lubavitch. And she tried to see what's going on inside the KGB offices to know what is happening in order for the Hasidim to be able to continue and to thrive. And one day she saw a fellow, or she used to see him all the time come in, a fellow by the name of David Yitschak. David Yitschak grew up in Lubavitch, went to the yeshiva, and now he had a long beard, so he looked like a regular Hasidic Jew. But don't judge a book by its cover always. So probably anyone who had a beard in those days was either an authentic real Jew, or they were somebody pretending to be a Jew. You know, today there's a sign, I saw a billboard in New York, Hasid or hipster, because the hipsters have beards and the Hasids have beards. So which one is it? And this guy, David Itcha, looked like a Hasidic Jew, but he worked for the KGB. My grandmother did the opposite. She looked a little bit more modern, but she was working for Chabad. It's interesting how they had opposite roles. And she would see this guy coming in, and she always tried to eavesdrop and listen into his conversations. And one day he came in with a big list. My grandmother got her hand on that list. And she saw the names of many of the prominent Hasidim living in Moscow at the time. He was informing on them. He was telling the KGB exactly where they live, what they do, their involvement. This one is operating the mikvah. This one is secretly shechting, slaughtering kosher meat. This one's doing this one's doing that. Gave him the whole list. My grandmother reviewed that list. That night, she went around Moscow. I've been to Moscow. It's a big city. She took the underground metro here, there, everywhere. She made sure to go all these people's homes. There was no WhatsApp them to send them a message and say, hey, they're after you. She went around telling all these people. And that night, later that morning, she knew she'll be caught for this because how many people knew about this list? She took her family and they left Moscow. They went to Samarkand, to Uzbekistan, where my father lived the next couple of years during the war. It was good that they left anyways because the Nazis were marching towards Moscow and life in Moscow was becoming perilous either way. So they knew it was time to go, and that was her last heroic act before she left. Thank God she survived. She went into the passport printing business where they got different fraudulent passports and were able to save more lives to leave after the war. But that's a whole separate story. We read a book about it. There's a book called Samarkand, which actually takes you into the life of what they experienced, the history they went through. But the whole point is that I was telling you the story just to illustrate how some Jews got caught up in the KGB and would become informants like this David Itcha was, and they called him David Itcha der Musser. He was known as the informer. And who knows what they did? You know, it could be they tortured them, it could be they threatened their families. Who knows? Now there's a great story about a particular Jew living in Dnepropetrovsk. My father was born in Moscow. They're very far from Dnepr. But Dnepropetrovsk, which was the city, Yekaterinoslav, where the Rebbe was raised by his parents. His father was the chief rabbi of that city. And there was a fellow there by the name of Chaim. Chaim lived in the same apartment building as the Schneerson family, right above the Rebbe's family's home. Above, the apartment above, Rabbi Levi, Yitschak, and Rebbe and Schneerson. Now this guy was one of those informants. He was Jewish. And he was officially, his official job to the people in the building was, he was the building manager. When I got married, we lived in an apartment building in Brooklyn. The building manager was called the superintendent. They called him the super. You knew the super's apartment was where you went when you had problems, when you had trouble, you went to him. But this guy, that was his official job. But everybody knew that his undercover job was, he was the link, the informant to the Russian authorities, to the KGB and the NKVD about all the illegal activity that the rabbi was conducting. So his apartment was right above the rabbis. So if they had a Shabbos dinner and sang songs, if they had a Torah class, if they had a minyan, all these were illegal activities under communist regime, then he could inform them and say what happened. And it was a very interesting story that happened one day. So I believe the video will tell the story. Do you want me to tell the story? The video tell the story? I'll let the video tell the story, and if it's not clear, I'll tell you the story after the video. How's that? Okay, listen up.
Lived in Dnipropetrovsk, Ukraine. In the 1930s, he attended underground Torah classes taught by the Rebbe's father, Rabbi.
Sorry, what's happened here? Something's happened.
By Levi Yitschak Schneerson.
Семья Рава, вся семья жила на втором этаже.
Just on here. Hold on a second.
На этаже жил человек, который был управляющим этого дома, коммунист, еврей, но который, между прочим, на которого возлагалось следить за рабом, следить и докладывать вышестоящие органы. Короче говоря, вот он такую роль играл. И вот однажды было такое вот дело. Значит, в семью Рава пришла женщина и сказала, что я хочу, чтобы моя дочка вышла замуж, значит, чтобы у нее была свадьба только по-еврейски. Чтобы была хупа, чтобы все как полагается было. Ну, Рав говорит, давайте ее сюда. Привели ее и тут же поставили хупу, но нужны были свидетели. Кто-то, нужно были еще люди. Да? Людей не хватало, и тогда Рав говорит, я знаю, кого пригласить. Давайте пригласим вот этого самого Хаима, который живет. Ну, все удивились, потому что знали, что Хаим ведет себя не так, как прилично, неприлично. Он говорит, давайте его позовем. Его позвали, он принимал участие в этой свадьбе. Потом Рав с ним говорил, беседовал. И он ему признался. Рав и так знал. Он ему признался, что он вот, за ним следит и так далее. Он коммунист. И в следующую субботу он пришел в синагогу. Это было тогда, когда синагог уже было очень мало. На весь город 2. Одна помещалась на улице Фрунзенской, а другая, там дальше Литейная такая улица была в центре. Там помещалась. И все прихожане синагоги знали так друг друга. И вдруг среди них появился вот этот человек. И он сказал очень громко, прошу меня не бояться. Я такой же еврей, как вы. Их бенаид. Этот коммунист потом стал активистом. Да? Активистом, ну знаете, активистом за то, чтобы еврей остался евреем. Понимаете?
I'm going to go back into what we just watched and to understand what was being said. I mean, that story is in Russian. And as much as I grew up with a Russian father, my Russian's not perfect myself, but I could speak somewhat of Russian because I grew up with understanding. I understand a little bit, but I understand if you didn't understand. So let me just repeat the story. The story was that this is during the communist regime. This is before the arrest of the previous of Rabbi Schneerson. And at the time, he said it was 1935. This man on the video is relating the story that he lived there. So this video was recorded many years ago. But he said there was a woman came to the house of Reb Levi, and she told him that her daughter and son-in-law, they were actually high-ranking officers, members in the Communist Party. And they were afraid to have a Jewish wedding in public because they were Jewish, but they wanted to get married. But they trusted that Rabbi Levi Yitschak would conduct the ceremony clandestinely, secretly for them, without telling anyone. So he agreed. The couple arrived that night, and Rabbi Levi Yitzchak prepared everything needed for a proper chuppah, right? What do you need for a chuppah? You need 4 poles with a talus or something to put above it. Today we have very pretty chuppahs. Even then you had very, very pretty chuppahs. But if you want to you don't need the poles. You can have just 4 people holding it, right? But you need a minyan. And you need some good food. So the Rebbetzin got busy baking some pastries. But very importantly, what else do you need? A minyan, very good. And he could only invite Jews, though, that he could rely on, that he could trust, that they won't inform on them to the authorities. So they had to come up with a plan very quickly. This is a secret, clandestine mission. And they got together a total of 9 people. 9 men. What's the problem? Oh, you need 1 more. Where are we going to get the 10th man for this minyan? Now, if it's an ordinary day, at my shul, sometimes if we ever struggle with a minyan, we could go outside and see who's biking, who's running, and get somebody in. But this isn't the kind of situation you could do that. So they were thinking, deliberating, there's another guy you could call. But he's the informer. What are we going to do? The Rebbe's father said, let's call Chaim. The informer, the building manager. And everybody was shocked. But Rebbe Levi Yitzchak remained calm, and they called for him. Chaim entered, and Rebbe Levi told him that he wants him to serve as the 10th man of their minyan, so that this bride and groom could get married according to Jewish law. And Chaim, as you saw in the video, the way this guy described it, he says, what? Like he was bitten by a snake or something. You want me? And the rabbi looked at him and said, that's right. We want you. Chaim, as he described in the video, ran around drawing all the curtains, and the chuppah was set up, and the couple was married, and the ceremony was conducted. And as soon as it was done, everybody obviously secretly, quickly left the premises so nobody gets into trouble. But Chaim actually stayed on. He stayed behind. And he approached Rebbe Levi Yitzchak, and he showed him his Communist Party cards. He admitted that he was spying on the rabbi and his wife and the family, which of course they knew. And he said, from now on, Rabbi, I am with you. I don't want to be part of this antagonistic behavior. I don't want to be an informant to my co-religionists. And he said, these papers, the communist cards, are worthless. And they were worthless. You think of it. Communism is gone. The Communist Party only benefited the people at the top. Everyone else, everyone was equally poor. The only ones who were more equal than others were the ones at the top of the party. And this guy you saw in the video, Israel Adamski, this fellow right here, he described how he was at that
Mr.
event.
Israel
He was
Adamski.
there. So I don't know, this video was recorded in the 1990s, and he was there in 1935. He was a man who went through a lot. Okay, and he described the next morning, this Chaim was at the minyan. There were only 2 shuls that were active. There were many shuls in the Dnepropetrovsk. But remember, the communists shut down the shuls. They would allow 1 or 2 shuls to show the world, look, there's no religious persecution here, no discrimination. And people would come to the shul They always had a watchful eye on it, but people would come. And guess who came to the minyan the next day? Chaim. And at first, people kept a distance. You can imagine, because Chaim had the reputation, had a name as an informer. But Chaim said to them, don't be afraid of me. I'm a Jew just like you. I'm not looking to cause trouble. And Chaim, as we know, had a complete change of heart, as Israel Adamski describes in the video. And he became an activist for Jewish programs and for activities and helping the shul and bolstering the minyan and helping Jews remain Jewish in the former Soviet Union, which itself was a very heroic act. Pardon? Ich bin Ayid, exactly. That's what he said. Ich bin Ayid. Sadly, we know that after Rabbi Levi Yitschak was arrested, he was never allowed to set foot into Yekaterinoslav again. And it looked at the time like the communists won. He was exiled. He was sent off to Kazakhstan, to a place called Chile, where he endured very horrific conditions. He was tortured, and unfortunately succumbed to it and passed away, and was not afforded a proper burial. Today, the government of Kazakhstan refuses to allow his burial place to be moved because they consider it a shrine. They consider it a tourist attraction. People come to Kazakhstan to pray at his resting place. So today it can't be moved. But we know that while it looked at the time very difficult, as if the communists won, as if he'd been defeated. But the truth is, we know, if you look at Judaism today, this rabbi's son, who was the Rebbe, continued his father and father-in-law's work. And the Rebbe sent, even during the dark period of communist regime, sent emissaries behind the Iron Curtain to maintain regular contact with the Jewish community. And he persevered and preserved the embers of the flames that his predecessor and that his father had stoked. And he continued to keep Yiddishkeit alive. If this time, maybe I'll show you the video called Embers, a video that's worth watching. I have to see if I can get the sound, because that one does not have good sound online. But despite the authorities' best efforts, an underground network of Judaism thrived throughout the Soviet Union. I was watching a video yesterday of Mordechai ben David, very popular Hasidic pop singer. And Mordechai ben David describes going in the 80s and 90s to Russia to perform concerts at the end of the Iron Curtain, at the end of the communist era, and after the fall of the Iron Curtain. And when the Soviet Union fell, the Rebbe openly sent emissaries there. You look at Chabad in Russia today, it's unbelievable. I have cousins, like I said, living in Kharkiv and other parts, many shluchim and all these places, friends who I know who are active and building up Yiddishkeit. You see how robust and thriving Yiddishkeit is in those places. And this picture here is very interesting, because if I were to ask you, where's the world's biggest Jewish center, you might say America or Israel. But you know something? There's no center in Israel, I think, that is as big as this place. In Ukraine. In what city? The city where the Rebbe was raised, in the Dnepropetrovsk. This is the prize for the Rebbe there. It's such a large, active Jewish community. And I mean, I don't know if it's the biggest in the world, but it's certainly the biggest in Europe, okay? If you stand on the viewing balcony of this building, I've never been there, but my brother was, and he described, you could look out and you could see the little shul where Rabbi Levi Yitschak Schneerson operated from. It's still there. It's that bottom building. So if you could see that little building in the front, that's the original shul where Rabbi Levi Yitschak was rabbi, where the Rebbe grew up. That big center around it was built by the Rebbe's emissaries. It has in it yeshiva, school, housing for the rabbis. There's so many rabbinic families there. They have their banqueting halls. They have a hotel for visitors. They have kosher shopping supermarket, like a whole mall of Jewish-oriented stuff that's closed on Shabbos. And you look down and you see the very shul where he was arrested. And you compare, you could see what prevailed. that Judaism is not just surviving, didn't just survive, it thrived. Okay? That community that he built, that he gave up his life for, is alive and flourishing today. And the old Soviet prison to where he was taken lies derelict and decrepit, outdated, ancient. Who was vindicated? Who won? Who defeated whom? And I think that's the finest postscript to this whole story. That his life did not end with his passing. He unfortunately passed away in Kazakhstan, but his Rebbetzin, his wife, Rebbetzin Chana, she and her husband raised a son who oversaw the greatest Jewish renaissance in the history of our people. And this whole Jewish reawakening happened everywhere, including their very city, the Dnepropetrovsk. You look at that building, you say, wow, Judaism is alive. And this, I think, is just an incredible postscript to their story. And just to recap some of the points that we discussed, just because we're concluding and wrapping up today's discussion, but I think it's worthwhile to think about our own lives and think about who we were. You ever look at pictures of yourself from a number of years ago and say, was ist geschehen? What was. Your name is the same, but the body changes, right? Our opinions change. Our priorities change. Things change. Shift happens. And let's go back and remember the chamber in the temple. What was that chamber called? The Lishkas Parhedrin. Let's look at the message and lesson we could take from it. Because this chamber teaches us an important lesson. It was called also Lishkas Ha'etz, the chamber of wood, which symbolizes and represents longevity. The room stayed the same, right? But yeah, the name changed because its purpose changed. Sometimes a name reflects not what something looks like, but what it has become. And that room, I think, represents the idea that while, yes, the sages were trying to reprimand and inspire some rebuke to the corrupted high priests of the time, but Rabbi Levi Yitschak learned another lesson, and to say the purpose of a Kohen Gadol is to be the role model, to inspire the people. What makes somebody a leader? Is it their title? Is it the degree? Is it the money they paid for that position? Well, in some cases, maybe it was. But even that, like I said before, what were they aspiring towards? They wanted a position they could go into the Holy of Holies, even though they knew they wouldn't come out alive. But I think there's a message here that every one of us is leaders. We're all leaders of our own circle of influence, whether it's our family, our community, wherever it might be, our people who look up to us. And let's realize there's a crown on our heads. We're the king of our castle. Okay? And this character that each of us possesses in our hearts. And the Kohen Gadol, I mean, think of what a Kohen Gadol looked like. They were the most magnificent garments ever made. The Kohen Gadol carried such a responsibility. And on the one hand, you could say, well, the clothing is not what makes a person holy, right? Let me ask you, we know money could buy a lot of things, right? Money could buy a bed, but it can't buy you a good night's rest. Money could buy you medicine or a good doctor's visit, but it can't guarantee good health, right? What else? Money could buy a house, but it can't buy a home. Money could buy food, but it can't buy an appetite. Money could buy influence, but it can't buy respect. And it can even buy the office of the Kohen Gadol. It can't buy you happiness either. It could buy you gadgets and things and stuff and shows, but it can't buy happiness. And the money couldn't buy the position, the Kohen Gadol, the true position of the Kohen Gadol, the holy position. But even still, I would say that even though those Kohanim were corrupted, I think there's still a lesson besides for the aspiration for the priesthood. The Rebbe looked at it in another way and said it was called Lishkas Ha'etz, the chamber of wood, the chamber that wood comes from the tree. And we have to realize the comparison of a tzaddik, of a righteous person to the tree. Trees don't make the noise while they're growing, right? Every day you wake up and you go, whoa, how did that tree grow like that, right? Well, we know that it took effort, it took water, it took time, it took everything, the TLC. And when we look at the longevity of the tree, we realize that it grows, and each of us grows. And that was the idea of this room, that how does it grow? If you want it to grow in the right way, it needs the tender, loving care, which each of us has to give, of course, to our children, to our grandchildren, to our students, to the people we influence. And that means watering the tree. That means protecting it. That means doing everything that it was required for it to be able to grow. That was one element of the reason it was called Lishkat Ha'etz, the wood chamber. But we know it was given another name by the sages, which seemed like a mockery. Lishkat Par Hedrin, which, as we discussed, par means separated. It means this idea of dividing, which the corruption caused. And Har, the mountain, which is hard and unmoving, and Din, which is judgment. But Rabbi Levi Yitschak gave us another interpretation, which I think is very important, about the mountains. The mountains don't move because of opinions. The mountain is resilient. The mountain is strong, right? And we know opinions change. Right? 1 week someone's a hero, the next week they're being canceled. But a mountain is unmovable. It stays, and it stays in the right place. That was the other message, that we have to realize what it means to stay in your place, to be resilient, to be strong. And that even if we make mistakes, we could veer right back in. The hardest person to judge is ourselves. Right? We excuse ourselves. It's easy to judge everyone else. We can see when everyone else's teeth are crooked or discolored. What about our own? Oy, oy, oy. And then we realize this other meaning of this term, parahedron, is that no matter where you roam, you could always come back home. No matter where and how circuitous that route might be. And perhaps another reason we could be discussing this now is because Elul is a week away. And Elul is the time for Teshuvah. We're only 5 weeks to Rosh Hashanah. 5 weeks from this Friday will be Rosh Hashanah. So how are we preparing? How are we getting ready? Maybe we shouldn't leave it for the last minute to decide what our New Year's resolution is. Maybe we use the next 5 weeks to think of our last year's resolution. Have I kept it? Have I improved? I got 5 weeks to finish up last year's resolution and 5 weeks to think about how I'm going to become better in the next year. And this is something we could all think about, because sometimes when we look at others, people disappoint us. You look at your children or grandchildren and say, "Hey, they didn't live up to my expectations," right? We don't stop loving them, right? And that's the point. That's the way Hashem sees us. And that's what Rabbi Levi Yitzchak's interpretation of the Lishkas Parhedrin was. That even though there were mistakes in life, even though there were diversions and digressions, right? When we were young, life was about proving ourselves. And as we get older, life becomes about improving ourselves. Nothing to prove, right? Sustaining ourselves. And the Torah says you're never too old to grow. So I think these messages are for all of us, okay? If you look at a tree stump, every ring in it symbolizes another year. Every one of these wrinkles here represents something. Faith and love and joy and loss and children and grandchildren and experiences and recovery and growth. Every experience hopefully makes us stronger. Like every ring in the tree represents the tree's past. Every wrinkle in us also represents our own past. And so just as the idea of the Kohen Gadol was on the one hand to be that tree, to symbolize the longevity and the righteousness and piousness, but at the same time, the Parahedra, the tax assessor, showed the windy path. Let's look beyond the misbehaviors. Let's look at the soul, okay? And you look at the story of Chaim, who completed that minyan. Why?
Mr.
Because the rabbi was able to see beyond him. And there we look at this. Look at what can come in the very city where the communists worked and destroyed. But look how Chabad rebuilt. So my friends, think about our own lives. Think about whatever goals you've achieved or haven't yet achieved. And I think there's a lot to look at. You hold up your own mirror. What do you see? Don't just see the wrinkles and the gray hair. Don't just see an older version of your previous self. See what Hashem sees. See who you are and the potential you still could be. And that, I think, is our important message of that chamber that had two names. We also do. One name describes who we've been, and the other describes who we're becoming. There's a famous author who talks about the resume, what we write in our resumes and our CVs, who we pretend we are, and then there's our eulogies, or our will be remembered for. What do they call it in the newspaper? Not the eulogy. What do they call it when they? I don't even think it's done anymore. What is it called when they write in the newspaper about a person who's passed on? Huh? Not a eulogy, like a eulogy. Pardon? No, come on, guys. Don't be old like me. You don't think of those things. So, as they say, a young person has a future because of time. An older person has a future because of wisdom. And every morning Hashem gives us another day because Hashem still believes there's another mitzvah for us to do, another person for us to encourage, another lesson to learn, another step for us to take. And as long as we're alive, I think this Lishkas Eitz, the tree chamber, is still open. Every day we have opportunities to grow like the tree. And everything we've spoken about today, I think, fits right here in the palm of our hands, right? That little tiny seed with which the tree is planted, it doesn't look like much. But you know what's inside that little tiny seed? The potential for an entire tree. And that's how we have to see ourselves. Don't just see a seed that will disintegrate and that's going to go through, what is it called? Photosynthesis and all that. But rather see the potential each of us has, each of our children has. And I think this is a tremendous lesson. The Rebbe did not give up. He didn't despair, which is why he sent his emissaries everywhere. And you see that growth of Chabad everywhere. These are the parents of the Rebbe, Rabbi Levi and Rebbe Tzimchana. While we observe this yahrzeit, let's remember the gift they gave us of the Rebbe and the potential each of us could have by emulating his teachings. Good question? Yeah. With the Rebbe? Yeah, his parents couldn't even be at his wedding because they were banned from traveling. Yeah, absolutely. It must have been, his father passed away in 1944. The Rebbe got married in 1928. Let's just calculate. They didn't see each other from 1928, at least. I think from 1927 to 1944, they did not see each other. That's how many years? That's 17 years. Quickly, who are mathematicians? 27 to 44, I guess that's 27 years. I'm sorry, 17 years. 17 years, yeah. Interesting. Like Yaakov and Yosef, also. Yeah. Very interesting parallel. Okay, any questions? Otherwise, we'll conclude right here for today. See you all tomorrow, and looking forward. Enjoy lunch, enjoy